Hello, Nick Majerison here, and this is Top Med Talk. And this is part 4 of EBPOM 2018, Any Answers? A programme which was originally streamed in full on topmedtalk.com. If you missed out on that, here's what I want you to do. To make sure you're always part of Top Med Talk when we stream live on the website and all of the major programmes that we do, I want you to listen to the end of this podcast where I'll explain to you how you can be part of our mailing list. That's just towards the end of this podcast, but before that, let's get into a conversation about the Enhanced Perioperative Care for High-Risk Patients trial, the EPOC trial. The results were a bit of a shock for some people, and we do a deep dive here with Monty and Desiree, explaining what it means and, more importantly, how we move forward. Have a listen.
Top Med Talk. For the last section of this discussion now, a lot of the meeting in a great way was about quality assurance and quality improvement. So we've seen a real growth in the number of trials, big trials that are informing perioperative practice. So we're getting up to trials of tens of thousands of patients now. We're increasingly well informed. There's a global belief in enhanced surgical recovery principles, and the USA is going at scale and pace now on that. We thought we were informed, at least the majority agreed, about balanced versus saline. We've got a clear, multi-centre, thousands of patients trial that moderately liberal is safer for the patients than zero, balanced or restricted. And we're increasingly well informed about goal-directed, that means different things to different people. But at the end of the day, the struggle seems to be implementation.
Yeah. The translation.
Exactly. It's, we're told that the biggest developments we can probably make in healthcare is to do what we know, not just to relentlessly keep discovering. So, and maybe that's where the machines will help. So what the overall discussions about QA versus QI. Before we get into some detail of that, what did you take from that?
Yeah, well, I love that because I hadn't actually heard it kind of, you just hear quality assurance being that you're checking the boxes to make sure kind of what they're doing versus actually trying to improve what you're doing based upon what the information that you have. So I thought it was good to break that down. And we did hear about that quite a bit from some of these clinical leads for these national quality improvement programs. And I think all of us are struggling right now on how to develop ways to really implement those quality improvement programs because we know it's an uphill battle. We know there are many challenges that go with that. And I really enjoyed hearing some of the ways in which the programs here in the UK are addressing those issues.
So for many quality assurance endeavours, we've had a sort of audit of current practice. We've described what better looks like. We've thrown a party, got the coffee out, got the cake out, given a lecture, printed some posters, and hoped that things would get better. Right. Now we had the results presented. We were promised we would hear the results of the EPOC trial. Yes. Rupert Pearce, along with Carol Peden, are two of the lead investigators with that. It's a huge endeavour. Enhanced perioperative care for high-risk patients, EPOC. So this was a stepped wedge cluster randomised trial. So this means that you start at a particular centre and you implement a quality improvement programme, and then as you start to hope to get improvement and learn from that quality improvement programme, you introduce that into 2 new hospitals, and then 4, and then 8, and then 16, such that over time you accumulate more hospitals and it effectively ends up like a randomised controlled trial. They were aiming to do, I can't remember what it was, 70 or 80 hospitals. I think ended up with 93.
Yeah, more. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they were aiming to recruit about 20,000 patients, and over 20,000 patients. They ended up with 17,000. So this is not; these are not small numbers. This is a huge endeavour, and we were all sitting there with bated breath, waiting for the release of this result. Which we got the results. We got the results. We got the results. Very, very exciting. So here is Rupert Pearce with the results of the EPOC trial.
And so I didn't forget that you guys don't know what the findings are. Do you like to know what the findings are? You're not sure. Okay, you're a bit nervous. I'm a bit nervous too. In fact, we didn't show any difference in mortality at all. There was no impact on 90-day mortality and no suggestion of a non-significant trend of mortality related to the quality improvement project and the care pathway we sought to implement. nor was there any impact at all on 180-day mortality from this quality improvement approach. You can imagine our frustration after all the work we'd done, let alone your frustration after all the work you'd done.
So the audience, you heard...
dun, dun, dun.
So you heard the
audible gasp.
And there was no doubt
No.
that those results were exactly the same. So what did you make of it? What did you pick up? Because, I mean, you have done a follow-up interview with Rupert, and the full results of the EPOC trial have gone out today on Top Med Talk, so you can listen to the full lecture and all the information wrapped around it. But you also did, which has also gone out, quite a detailed roundtable discussion about it. Why didn't it make a difference?
Well, when talking to Rupert, it was really great because by the end of the conversation, we had kind of turned it around about the positive aspects of this study and what we have learned from it. I think first, something that he was addressing during the conference was people were really concerned about the complexity of the process and what they were doing and how that might be the issue. But I think what he and others have found is it's not the complexity of the pathway, but it's the complexity of the implementation. And then he boiled it down to basically resources, that people don't have the resources to handle this type of thing. So it's time and money. And so I think that for what we can make of this is that it's difficult to implement big quality improvement programs, not necessarily based on what the process is, but how we handle the process and how we implement it as a hospital facility and as a team. So that's where the complexity lies. So I think it's really social issues
and cultural
issues.
So
yeah.
I think when we Rupert presented in greater detail, there were multiple steps in this example, tens of steps, and it's a relatively light touch quality improvement program. Mm-hmm. And in compliance with the elements they were hoping to improve, they didn't really move the needle.
No.
So let's take when you gave the antibiotics or the presence of people or goal-directed therapy was at a percentage to begin with in let's call it the control arm. The interventional arm, they didn't move the needle. So there was no
uptake on it.
Let's call the quality improvement measures the drug. There was no dose of drug. There was no. Whereas we heard about a different trial. We heard about the Emergency Laparotomy Collaborative, referred to as ELC. It's smaller, but as I got the impression it was much simpler from its objectives, the number of objectives, and much more heavily weighted in terms of resource. So I'm just going to play a little bit from Neil Quiney, who one of the leaders of that, who's going to give us an overview, because that lifted the spirits again from the point of view that
it's really simple stuff, I'm afraid. So do an early warning score or measure lactate right at the beginning, and start resuscitating people if you need to. Give them antibiotics if they're septic. Strange idea, but it's evidence-based. Get people to theatre, we thought within 6 hours, not delaying to the end of the lists and midnight when leave the registrars to do it. Use some fluid resuscitation techniques to optimise fluid management. We've heard plenty about that today. And admit people to the ITU, because there was some evidence that admitting people to intensive care is beneficial to outcomes. And get consultants involved throughout, so both consultant anaesthetists and consultant surgeons. It wasn't rocket science, but plenty of people called me up and said, "What's your pathway?" It wasn't difficult. So we put that together. I think someone's mentioned it today already. 4 hospitals across the south of England. And just to sort of summarise, quite an interesting 8 months project. We had historical data, but on the 30-day outcomes, risk-adjusted mortality rate by 38% and in-hospital mortality rate reduced by 42%. So I was pretty stunned by that data, and people sort of picked it up around the country.
So that's really what we were hoping for the big trial. I mean, that's what informed it to a certain extent. 38% and 42% differences in mortality, accepting the fact that it's 4 hospitals, 8 months, but they've been rolling that out now they're rolling it out in Wales, I understood, the country of Wales. So that's getting real traction, but it's different. That the resource implications for requirements. So I'm just going to. They were both Niall and Carol Peden were asked about the differences. So let's just hear about that from them.
first Niall and then Carol. How do you contrast the two results?
So the two projects were really, same patients but completely different setup. One was a sort of step wedge trial. We were quality improvement. The intervention that EBPOM recommended was 37-point care bundle. Well, where do you start on that? We had 6 simple steps, and I think most QI evidence suggests that you do it simple and you might get an effect. And I think that probably the most important thing is that my understanding with EPOC is that the hospitals were invited to one day, which Tim and Carol mostly ran, which was a pretty full-on day, but it was a crash course in QI and all knowledge, and off you go, and we'll see you again in 2 years' time. Whereas we actually sort of tried to create a community within our group. So we met 8 to 10 times. We ran webinars. We had Geeta was at the end of a telephone or an email account or whatever, answering questions. We had the website. We had pamphlets. We had mugs. We had competitions. We had Sarah Hare with a competition and coffee bribery. So we had a real community developed, and that's something you could sense throughout the project. And I think those are probably the 3 key differences between us and EPOC.
Yeah, thank you. I think they're really 2 different studies completely. And you have to remember, and I think Rupert stressed this, when we design the EPOC trial, that was 2 years prior to ELC, and we were in some ways earlier in our learning, and in some ways EPOC, I think, reflects what really happens in real life. A major report comes down from a national body with 35 or 40 recommendations and says, do this. So we were trying to bring together a lot of the number of recommendations that had been made, and within the funding we had at the time for that study, which was very QI light, I think, you're correct in that, Neil, that Tim Stevens and I, we had one day followed up by a half day. We did have a website and follow-up phone calls. The other important thing, I think, between the 2 studies is the community, because the nature of the step wedge randomized control trial did not allow us on a regular basis to bring the teams together because people were being activated at different points. And I do think in quality improvement, and it's well written in the collaborative literature, that that synergy of getting teams in the room, sharing ideas, as IHI would say, stealing shamelessly from each other, is very important. And because of the rigorous aspect of the EPOC study and the way it was run, we could not do that. But I do think that's important. I think, and as we said this morning, there's a lot of learning from EPOC. They're different beasts, and I think there's a paper yet to be written, putting it all together and taking the key lessons from that.
So that's...
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Those 2 perspectives. And if you think about it, I think both of these studies gives us, the people on the ground trying to do this every day, a good perspective and somewhere to start. There's a lot of learning that can come from that we can put in a practical way when we're going to implement things such as an enhanced recovery program in our community facility. I think there's some good ideas that have come out of that and can be really useful.
And you've lived this.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, we know...
You've lived this.
Yeah. Well,
on a national scale, right?
Data's really important, really, really important. You know that, getting people to change is really, really important. But the other thing you notice is that there's a resource level where if you don't put adequate resource in, you're wasting your time and energy. So you have the full program, you have you leading it, you have the nurse navigator. It goes really well, and then someone decides to cut the resource, and then it all falls apart again, isn't it?
Absolutely.
That's such a reproducible cycle, and we've done that at scale in the UK.
Yeah.
So we don't have time to go into it now. We're doing a follow-up program, but PQIP clearly demonstrates we've slipped back from where we were in 2012 from our enhanced recovery programs. And you've seen that locally?
Absolutely, locally. It's the same thing. And actually, Sir Bruce kind of talked about it whenever he was giving his plenary about, that he doesn't want to, as the director of the national healthcare system, he didn't want to have to develop these programs, and he knew that. But one thing that he didn't realize, and it took him a while after multiple conversations, was that he just had to provide the resources for the people to do it and put it in their hands with that.
So in closing, right at the beginning for this follow-up, right at the beginning, we heard from Ramani Munasinger pointing out the fact that data remains one of the big challenges for all of us.
Because we don't necessarily know what we're doing. And it's interesting to me that surgeons often don't know, for example, what their complication rates are. In particular, really common complications. The top two most common complications, we believe, are surgical site infections and post-operative pulmonary complications. And we don't necessarily measure these routinely in every hospital in the UK, and certainly not internationally.
So then we had that from Ramani, suggesting that data remains the problem. And back to that, looping back to that fact that it's infections and pneumonias, those things are the common problems we need to do about it. And the other thing she went on to talk about is culture.
Yeah.
So culture seems to eat everything for breakfast.
That's right.
It eats evidence.
It does.
It eats strategy. It eats tactics. Culture is the big challenge. Yeah. And that's what we get when we go back to work, isn't it? That is the big problem that we face.
Also, what should we be doing? This comes down to knowledge mobilisation, evidence-based medicine. We're all sitting here at the Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine Conference, but we represent a tiny, tiny proportion of people working in healthcare in the United Kingdom. We also, even those that come to conferences like this regularly, represent a very small proportion of knowledge mobilisation. So we will take, hopefully, some new knowledge home with us, but then we have to persuade our colleagues that they need to change their practice as a community in order to try and make patient care better. And then we come across this problem, and this is a very familiar normal distribution to most of you, I'm sure. This is the bell-shaped curve that was described by Everett Rogers in 1962 when talking about the diffusion of innovations. And you think about your department at home, and you can probably categorise your friends and colleagues into one of these groups. The innovators, the people that are always enthusiastic to try and change and improve, and perhaps sometimes trying to really, really be experimental about how they should do things. The early adopters, the early majority, and then all the way through to the 16% of people approximately that are laggards. So it doesn't matter how much evidence you provide them with, they will find a way of not changing.
And those laggards can put a lot of energy into doing nothing.
Oh, they absolutely can. They spoil some things sometimes if they have a loud enough voice.
Passive aggression. So that's a lot of what we're going to be concentrating on at our next EBPOM meeting in the USA in Chicago, September 28th to 30th. It's another perioperative practicum, which is a how-to guide concentrating on many elements of perioperative medicine, but also led by you and Vicky Morton about enhanced surgical recovery and how hands-on to implement that and how to get it to stick.
Yeah. So that's always my point. It's you can get a program started just like they did in the ELC program, and that's great if you have some great energy and momentum behind it. But that sustainability piece is huge.
Got to get it to stick.
Yep.
Like all these things in life. So please do stay connected with us. Please do get to the website on a regular basis. If you haven't subscribed yet on a podcatcher, please do. That's the way to get the podcast pushed to you on a regular basis. If you don't understand about podcatchers, etc., look on our website, and towards the bottom there's some great instructive videos about how to get into podcatching. I didn't know what it was about a year or so ago, but I'm quite addicted now.
Or ask your teenager.
Exactly, ask your teenager to help you. So the sun is still shining here in London against all odds. Actually, it is actually shining at the moment. It had been cloudy a little bit this afternoon the first time. I don't think you've seen a drop of rain since you've been, have you, Desiree?
I have not one drop.
A whole series of anniversaries. The NHS is 70, EBPOM is 20. Today the RAF, our Royal Air Force, is 100 years old. We watched the flyby that was put on for the Queen. Came past the building here. We're up on the top of Howe & Co.'s building where Top Med Talk Studio is at 1010 Great West Road. And against, it must be a very special year because England are still in the Football World Cup. We were laughing about this a week ago. They're still there along with Croatia, France and Belgium. Now, that's a lineup you wouldn't have expected. Now, we've got to go because one of those won't be there in a few hours' time.
Right.
And England-Croatia tomorrow night. So thank you very much indeed for listening to us. Don't hesitate to follow us on social media. You always do this better than me, Desiree.
Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and one more?
Yeah, there must be more out there.
There's all of them. Facebook. Oh my gosh, how could I forget it?
So thanks very much everyone for listening to Top Med Talk. Those of you who are interested, enjoy the full Top Med Talk.
So interesting stuff there from Desiree Chappell and Monty Mython. Now, if you've stuck around to find out how you can be part of our mailing list, here's what I want you to do. Go to topmedtalk.com or check out the show notes to this podcast and sign up as soon as you can so that you get an email alert every single time we plan to go live on the website. That way you can be part of the programme as it goes out live, and you can even interact with the people who are sat in this studio speaking to the world. Be a bigger part of Top Med Talk and sign up to the website now. Email alerts from topmedtalk.com. Also, of course, if you want to meet the Top Med Talk team, all you need to do is pop along to one of our events. Go to ebpom.org/meetings. Our next big event is between the 28th and the 30th of September in Chicago. That's EBPOM USA, the Chicago Masters Course, Perioperative Care Practicum. Between the 28th and the 30th of September, ebpom.org for more details. That's ebpom.org.